In this last video on lookup and reference formulas, I'm going to wrap up and summarize the lookup, vlookup, match, and index functions quickly. Let's start with the lookup and vlookup formulas using an approximate match. So we started off in the first video with this test results list, and then we were trying to compare this percentage to this grading scale to figure out what letter grade does this percentage, 59%, equate to. Obviously you can visually see that it's a 59 right here. 0 to 59% gets a letter grade E. And so we don't want to manually look for it, we want Excel to look for it for us. So we're going to type the lookup formula, and again this is always an approximate match. I'm going to grab the lookup value, which is this percent, and then grab this lookup vector. So Excel is looking on the far left column for this percentage, and then it's going to return the furthest most column that you have selected, so the letter grade will be returned. I'm going to lock it up with F4 and then end the parentheses. You can see letter grade E, which is just as we'd expect. So let's go ahead and pop this down, and you can see, let's take a peek at this Chelsea grade. She got a 75% and it returned a letter grade C. So Excel, again, it looks in this far left column, comes down and says 75, it's greater than 70, greater than 73, but it hits 76 and says, wait, that's too much, it's not greater than that amount. So come back and then go across to the furthest most column that we had referenced. So it grabs letter grade C and returns it. Now there's a couple of things that I want you to remember about the lookup formula. And so that's first is that the lookup table, it needs to be sorted from smallest to largest. If it's sorted from largest to smallest, you can see here that errors are returned. So make sure that it's always smallest to largest. The next thing I want to point out is that this formula can be written in two different ways. And so we've written it first in this bottom way. So where this array is selected and the leftmost column is looked up upon and the rightmost column is then returned. But if we can write it in the top version, we can specify one single column as the lookup vector, which would be the percent column. And then we can say the result vector is the grade column and lock that up with F4, and we'll get the exact same answer. But the thing that's nice about the second way is that we can grab it and drag it over to the left side or the right side or reference an entirely different table if we want to. So just keep that in mind. Now let's take a look at how we can write this using the Vlookup formula and also using approximate match as the lookup type. So we can say that our lookup value is 59%. And the table array is obviously this grading scale. And so with the Vlookup formula, it's kind of like the exact same way we did the lookup formula at the beginning, where it's looking at the leftmost column, but instead of returning the farthest rightmost column as the return value, we're actually going to specify the column index. So I'm going to lock this table array up with F4 real quick. And comma, and the column index is specifying which column we want to have returned. So the first, second, or third. And we want obviously the third, comma, and we need to make sure that we do approximate match. So this is a case where approximate match is used. So I'm just going to type true and close it up. And we can copy that all the way to the bottom and hit enter. And you can see that the same values are returned just as they were for the lookup formula. The one thing I want you to see as a difference though is that we are fixed with the positioning of the return value. So it must be within this array. It needs to be in, as the Vlookup says, the table array. So the leftmost column is what's being looked up, and we can choose from any of these three columns to have returned. It's not like the lookup formula where we can change it to the second method of how we just showed it and move it to a different table or to anywhere else. It's fixed to this table array of the return value. Now last thing I want to take a look at is that match formula. And as you can see here, the lookup value first, let's go ahead and just take it as the lookup value. We're going to look into this percent column, and I'm going to start on this first value and not start on the headers. So Control Shift down, lock it up with F4, and put a comma, and we all know what exact match means. It says 59%, where does it exactly hit in this list? And so we're not really looking at those, we're looking at the approximate matches, which is the less than and greater than. So typically you'll use the less than. So let's start with 1 and close it up. And you can see the first position is where 59% is returned. You can see that because 59%, it's greater than 0, and 60 is greater than 59, therefore back up 1, and this row is number 1, so therefore return the first row. For 64, it comes down to 67, says that's too much, go back 1 and return 3. So this should return 3. And it does. So I think that makes sense as well, but the type that doesn't make sense might be the match type when it says -1, and that says greater than. So this may not make sense at all when I drop this down because it's all errors. And that's because we have our sort position as smallest to largest. Since it's now greater than, we need to say largest to smallest. And therefore you get the list flipped around, and now we have returning values. So this method, it says 59%. All right, 59 is less than this amount, less than that, and keeps on going all the way down the list until it hits 0 and says 59% is actually greater than 0. Therefore, back up 1. And what row is that? That's row 12. And so it returned row 12. Next, let's go ahead and review some of the exact match formulas, such as the index and Vlookup formulas. First, let's delete these answers, and let's look at what this sheet currently has. So it's the purchasing data that we're familiar with, and then over here we have the data validation that I've set up where it has the item ID number and the column number that we want to look up upon. And then based on these selections above, the match formula is returning the 15th row, and the match formula for the columns is returning the first column. So we can easily write the index formula up here and say we're looking at this array, and lock it up with F4, and we're looking at this row, comma, this column, and then close it up, and that's going to return 3443. But when we write the same thing with the Vlookup formula, you'll see that the Vlookup value is we're going to look up this item number. Okay, and to look up that item number, we need to have it in the leftmost column in this table array. So therefore, we have to start here in the middle. So I'm going to select this, lock it up with F4, comma, I'm going to scroll up real quick. And the next thing we need to do is grab the column index number, which we can't do to grab the PO number because it's outside of the table array. Therefore, we can only have return the item number through the buyer name. So let's just go ahead and put in the buyer name, which would be column 5. Comma, and we'll look for an exact match, so false, and hit enter, and JJB has done this. So as you can see, the index formula is much more powerful than the Vlookup formula in the sense that it can return anything on the sheet. No matter where the data is located, it can pull back any value that you want. And it's really simple to go ahead and say, I want to see this value, and I want to see the buyer number. And it's going to return the same thing as a Vlookup formula. And the last thing I want to leave you with is that although this index formula is much more powerful than the lookup formula, I still use the Vlookup formula on a day-to-day basis simply because it's easier to type. I mean, take a look at what I've had to do to write this index formula to make it dynamic. I've had to reference 2 additional match formulas up here. So on a day-to-day basis, I choose Vlookup.